Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial on the 3rd of February. And David's on the board. I want to reiterate what I said last week, that I'd like some of you to be out there in the spring to see what spring herbs and habitat is in action, because often we look at the end of the spectrum when seed is there in fall and we collect seed, but there's a retinue of small plants that are often on the liliaceous side of things that come early in the spring that we miss if you don't watch. Even on Route 45, you get starry-eyed grass and pussy toes and plants that are no more than 6 inches high, and they're hard to follow. You almost have to flag them to know how to pick the seed. But one of the key things in preservation work is to make sure that you know enough to be helpful. The prairie is not a simple place. It's not a simple ecology. But just knowing a few of the plants is tremendously helpful. And the Natural Area Study Group does an excellent job of taking people to area sites so that they will know them better than to be transfer that information to other agencies like schools and parks. You don't have to expect to be perfect, but just knowing a little bit more about the overall ecosystem and what it is there for is very helpful and also interesting. Audubon does an excellent job with the bird side of things. We do have close natural areas. Busey Woods next to the Urbana Park District Anita Purvis Station is an excellent site, and people do on Sunday mornings watch the bird population as it migrates through, and some of it is permanent, and the Busey Woods becomes in part a rookery. It was an old meander that was cut off and channelized, but that meander creates a vernal pond, and there, if you have a dip net, you can go there and find water fleas and other creatures in the water even now. It may still be frozen over to some extent, but it's vernal, which means green pond, and it's very active. We spoke about Meadowbrook Park, but then we spoke about Lodge Park, Shady Rest, and Allerton, which are all about 25 miles away, and that's reasonably close. And it's not necessarily that these parks are perfect, but they give you an idea of what was here, whether it be the understory of a forest or the prairie that's out on the railroad bed adjacent to Allerton Park Farms. There is a railroad museum nearby, which makes it interesting to go there. There's the town of the city of Monticello with a square, and that is helpful at that is there too, and interesting, and it's intact. The railroads came through, and some of those railroads are abandoned, and they go into trails. If the trail is too wide, we lose the prairie that's on either side of the ballast. So I've been looking at this some and wondering how we lock into other organizations. And one of the organizations is the Land Connection, and it will be meeting in the I House on First Street on the 13th and 14th, mainly the 14th. This is a group that has gotten together to look at farms, and farming situation has changed a lot in a matter of 50 years. A lot of the small farms have been taken over by corporations, so that agriculture is becoming a more corporate thing. But that is a problem to some extent. It takes away that 80-acre farm or 200-acre farm and creates a 3,000-acre farm by coalition. And it sometimes takes out of action that family that had a few cows, a few horses, some dogs, some crops, but they were crops that were often included orchard and plants in amongst the orchards, a rollover for different plants, and kept the farm in sustainability from a point of view of soil. It didn't necessarily make a lot of money. In fact, some of the people who have lost out to corporate farming have been people who have been just on the edge of surviving, and a flood or a drought has taken them out. So the Land Connection is a regional base, and let me read you what their mission is. The Land Connection is a grassroots, Central Illinois-based 501c3 educational non-profit organization. It has a broad mission, from the soil to the supper table, that involves saving farmland at the risk of loss to sprawl, training new transitioning farmers, and linking the growers and eaters of local sustainability raised food. The goal is to cultivate a sustainable food system by cultivating healthy farms, healthy food, and healthy communities. If you take this principle into developing countries, whether it be in mid-America or Africa or in the Middle East or Asia, many small farms that might only be an acre or two have been coalesced into commercial farms. And that takes out this sort of camaraderie of plants and animals and people and communities that is a way of life. And when those people are taken over and given a television set or other technologies that they don't necessarily used to have to use, that group of people is somewhat lost, and also the fertility of the farmland is lost too. So I was tempted to research the land connection, and they left on their registration form a comment space. So I spent some time writing a comment, mainly oriented to the conference that was coming up on the 14th. These are very genuine people who do a lot at the farmers market. They bring food to the co-op. They are very concerned about organic and the definition of organic and how that they can fit into it, how they can fertilize without chemicalizing the soil, how they can rotate. We have lately increased the possible varieties of crops coming in and adding hemp. It's a kind of controversial because it's the same hemp as provides drugs. So there has to be some control over what sort of plant you're growing and what will be its specialty. In World War II, it was often encouraged to grow this plant because it provides for rope and was essential for wartime activities. That plant is not the plant that has been bred to provide cannabis drugs that are being talked about now, and also genuinely used in medicine and in recreational smoking. We have to know that in there somewhere there are smokers that are still using nicotine. There are also children and adults that want to get off smoking, and they're using vaping. And so there's a number of things that come together here. The conference will be dealing a lot with sustainability and how you apply herbicides and insecticides and chemicalization to what then gets labeled as organic. I wanted to say that we're down to 0.1%, less than 0.01% of the remnant prairie that we have left. It's basically on railroad lines. By happenstance, the railroad law prevented people from taking that ground over as rich agricultural land, glaciated land for agriculture. So if I take a plant like compass plant and take down its root, the top 2 feet can weigh 45 or 50 pounds. It has on top a stem that is hard and engineered in such a way that it can survive a drought. It is hairy. It has rosins that we don't know about. And we have in there biochemicals that we may need in the future. So my comment was that I would like to see the land connection look at the preservation of these plants and their utilization. They've spent millions of years adapting to the world in general and to change and to adaptation of the retreat of glaciers. So these plants are fairly well adapted to this landscape. Are we making use of that fact? Could that root of the compass plant be a lumber? Could it be utilized in other materials like geopolymers? Add fiber. Is this a fibrous plant that could be utilized? And that's just one of about 100 broadleaf plants and about 6 or 7 grasses. And we don't know very much about them. So could this land connection, which has set itself up as a foundation to bring people together more or less in a family style? And one of the things that I go back to over and over again is that we have rail trails that are excessively wide. It's very good for recreation, but in the process we take out the prairie that's on either side of the ballast. So we have a very good rail trail between Urbana and Danville starting. It's gotten as far as St. Joe, just 7 miles, and it's proving itself to be popular and community-oriented and economic, and people can transport themselves on bicycles to their work rather than using automobiles. When you make that trail so wide and go down the batters on either side of the ballast, then you lose contact with the remnant prairies that are left. And so I'm suggesting in my commentary that the land connection should look at the future development of rail trails. There are now 23,000 miles of them, very few in East Central Illinois. But what ones are being developed at the present time are taking out the prairie soil, which we can't replace. Each handful of soil has in it millions of microorganisms, and we have used that ecology that has evolved since glaciation and has helped to mature this very rich soil and till that has come from Canada. So we've taken advantage of the prairie, but then we're growing crops that are usually corn and soybeans. The soybeans wasn't a major crop locally for a long time until agronomists went around the world and collected glycine plants and brought them back and worked on them and bred them and worked on the nitrogen-fixing bacteria of legumes. That soybeans is a legume, and gradually got the crop that is giving us our agricultural wealth. Are there other plants in there that have been adapted through evolution to our climate, our soils, our moisture, and the like? In that case, I would beg the land connection to think about looking at narrower trails. It's possible that these trails are one size fits all, and that's an engineering principle that makes it feasible, but and less costly. If you go to that 100-foot wide corridor and dig it up and disturb it and take it back, you can replant it to prairie, but it's nothing like the original prairie that's there. Not that what we have left is that wonderful. It's depauperate because it has been invaded. It has a railroad down the middle of it. So there's creosote here and there. There are invasive species, and usually there's a road parallel which likes to be widened into the railroad bed. So the first 7 miles of this corridor is very wide. It's good for EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, because it is capped with gravel so that you don't have contact with any leftover creosote. And it is wide, which is quite respectable for ADA, American Disability Association people, where you can run a wheelchair and enjoy a corridor that, as you could not enjoy a roadside. So we're losing those little pieces of prairie very quickly. And when you're down to 0.01% left, then you have to think about the genetics of this. If you very quickly have lost half of your species worldwide, then in basically a few years, you have to think about that and think about worldwide sustainability. So it's not only the compass plant that you look at the starry-eyed grass or the monarda or the purple coneflower, and with great pride you preserve some of those plants. You can replace them with seed, but that is not going to bring you the complex that is of a remnant. So I wrote my letter. I might modify it again. That's often what I do. So I write once and keep going. And we are looking at connection. And connectivity means connecting places like Indianapolis and Danville and Champaign-Urbana and Decatur and Clinton, and having some sort of interaction between the various communities. And I speak to this often, but I picked up the Rail Trail magazine, and in there's an article about connectivity in the Pittsburgh area. So I thought I'd say something about that. The Pittsburgh area has the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers that come together to make the Ohio. And that confluence has character that in its day was used a lot by steel mills, and where they could bring together coal and steel, iron ore. And so it has a character that is nearer to the East Coast, but it has some of the same characteristics that we like to see for connectivity. The Heinz family has been there, and they have been producers of food, and so besides the steel companies, these corridors have been utilized right up to the edge of the waterways. So various mayors have gotten into this and decided to put trails on either side of the rivers, and to have those trails connect. It's been pretty difficult because sometimes it's the Steelers have their practice area right up to the river's edge, and can you take the prime football team to task and say, can we have some of your practice grounds for trail? And it also involves museums and natural history, and so it's taking a matter of 20 years to get these things together. And then there's some long-range connections. I was in Pittsburgh to a rail trail meeting some years ago, and the mayor and team rode in from Washington on a trail that is almost complete as a part of a trail across the country. Not everyone wants to be on a rail trail. There are often chipped limestone and heavy tide, so people who are into traveling across the landscape have narrow tires and a different setup. But this is bringing you close to nature, it's giving you ambiance, it's giving you exercise, and it's bringing communities together. So I was interested to read this article because I've been there and been on bridges that cross the rivers. I've seen where Washington visited and walked across the river at one stage in the late 1700s. I know some of the trails that run around Pittsburgh, the Montour Trail, I think it is, that connects old railroad lines around the city. And so some of these connections are there. And so I think we ought to look at these sorts of precedences for our own connectivity. If you're looking at Urbana to Champaign, for instance, there's several possible routes, whether they're north or south. If you're going to travel along University Avenue, that's not a very sensible thing to do because it's a very heavily trafficked area. And you have intersections like at Lincoln Avenue where there's not only a north-south corridor but an east-west corridor and a railroad line that goes across the same intersection. But there is a possibility that other communities have worked with the railroad companies to install a trail alongside the railroad line. We might have to do something to either educate the public or let the public allow bicycles to cross places like University Avenue and Lincoln. But in other communities like Belleville, the hospitals often use these trails to allow certain types of heart attack people to exercise on parts. So the trail not only becomes a vehicle for well and healthy people, but it also becomes a possibility for exercise which is close to either the Carl Clinic or Provena or Presence hospitals. Then we have to figure out how to get into Champaign and how to have niches that can bring together trail people and the concept of bringing historic railroads into Champaign from the Monticello Railroad Museum. And we're looking at a site that is near to the post office is on a recently abandoned Wabash line, which took trains coming in from Monticello area across Neal Street and through on what was called a Wabash cutoff, and then deliver a historic train to Champaign. We did have a connection there that let that sort of train come into town and not have to go on to the main line, so you didn't have to have a pilot from the main line to supervise, which is very costly. That has been taken up now. We might not be able to do that anymore because the old railroad station where we would park has been utilized very successfully for a Black Dog restaurant. But somewhere there should be a place where trains and bicycles and other organizations can get together once or twice a year, or even more than that. And the railroad maintains a 7-mile set of railroad tracks that has been closed, but it hasn't been demolished yet. And then we have 4 miles between Whiteheath and Seymour that we would like to restore. And every time we restore a railroad line or have it as a trail, then we preserve the prairie plants and the prairie soils and the microorganisms that are there. So that to me was an important thing to do. But if you don't know this sort of complex and this sort of thinking, then you can't stand up in a city meeting and suggest. Planners and others do an excellent job, but they're dependent on getting feedback from the community. Often that feedback amounts to very few people. So you have to have organizations like PACA to do this. PACA is a preservation and conservation organization that takes apart houses or buildings that are going to be demolished, and they redistribute those materials. And last week they had a meeting dealing with their constitution, which was, I thought, very well researched. They're a not-for-profit 501c3, but it's the document is like 15 or 20 pages long, with a list of things that have to be done to make this sort of organization viable. So when you're talking about connectivity and knowing about the possible variances of a trail connecting Urbana and Champaign, you need to know that the support of the state and federal government is behind this sort of thing, and also the region, and usually the cities. But there's a formality here that is quite challenging to the average citizen. So I'll just go through some of the things that you have to think about if you're going to be doing this sort of work. And it's getting more possible because we don't have to spend as much time at home. We're not here in the 1900s. I have to go back to my father's family, that he was the 14th child. We don't have 14 children anymore. And we have a whole lot of technology that allows us to be free of the kitchen and the resources that took a long time to work with at home, up to and including a little bit of farming or backyard gardening. So first of all, you need to define who you are and what the organization is about. It's called a mission. And then there is a membership. And there are classes of members. There are members who may be covered by insurance if they're helping. There's a need to terminate this organization if it fails. So where would the funds and resources go? There's a procedure for meetings. There's a board of directors. And what are their powers? What is their tenure? How long will they be in? Will they have 2 terms? Or what length will the terms be? Will they be compensated? Will there be officers, like 3 or 4 officers, the treasurer, the president, and others? And how will they organize? Will you have a CEO, a person who works with this organization on a daily basis? So what constraints does the executive director have? It may be on the amount of spending that the director can engage in, but might be that he has to go to the board to get an inclusion of a telephone or something like that. But that can be written into the rules of the game. There has to be insurance, especially if you're taking apart old buildings. And there are ways of nominating future boards, and they have rules. And so it's not so easy, and some of the details for some of us get to be loose, and we do the best we can, and that involves people that are specialists in tax, for instance. How much can you do, and when can you do it, and how do you go about inspiring a 501c3? So those are some of the things that we've been at in the last little while. In the process, we have to be fairly public for the mission that we decide upon, whether it's you're looking at eyes or birds or prairie or railroads. There has to be some use of the media. And this week we've had a couple of situations that are very helpful. Some run to advertising design and how we get information to the public on venues that are more commonly available to people. One of those venues is WEFT, a radio station, and we use that radio station to communicate, and we videotape this radio program. The radio program you can read on your computer. It's archived. You can get it on the air on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. Or we then move this program, we videotape it and include pictures and David's very good at doing that. And so this week we have had a huff and puff concern. When I speak, you hear my breath. And Mike Feldman has been very interesting in that he works with the microphones and see how they're compressed and organized. And some of you may be interested in just this little piece of technology which helps us to do a better job of broadcasting. Then after it got cold and now it warms up some, I went to the idea store, and I have a couple of thoughts about equipment there. I picked up a piece of equipment. David might be able to check it out on the video camera. It's a drill, and it's something that people would use in a different era, but also you would find it in developed countries where these small farms that we're talking about that often create sustainability and interaction and family-style farming. And so this piece of equipment, you put a drill in the end of it. It has a piece that you can put on your chest, and that allows you to drill into the side of a barn to put up clapboards and things like that. And it is engineered in a different era, and it's engineered for people involvement. One of our problems at the moment is that with all the apps we have, is that people who are in the middle span of things, not the people who are doing AI or artificial intelligence, they're the people who will lose jobs to computers that can do repetitive work and things like that. But then we also have a big population of people who need jobs. And those jobs go back to things like using a shovel and using a drill. And I have here a piece of equipment that it peels apples. Oh. So I'm looking at the camera and hoping you can see. So I'm taking an apple and I'm putting it onto a springs, and this is usually tied to a table, so I'm only trying to let you see what it is.
David, if you hold it over here. Yep, perfect.
So you can see that I have a piece of equipment that's been engineered in a different era, and here a little knife comes up and peels the apple. Oh. You get the idea. So there's the apple has been peeled, and there's the skin. And this is kind of marvelous, and we shouldn't lose track of some of those tools. Often people who don't have a lot of technology in their background have a screwdriver and a pair of pliers and a hammer, and but feel that we should not lose contact with those pieces of equipment. There's a guy named Eric Sloan who has put together books on tools and barns and museums and wood, and he wants to stress that we shouldn't lose contact with what a different era. It has been probably the role of someone who is very sharp to put up a mill run by water or run by animals that would grind your corn or your wheat. And so he puts together a series of books, I think there's probably about 20 of them, that deal with the landscape and its utilization in a past era. And the conference that I'm talking about on February at the I Hotel, February the 14th, 13th and 14th, is bringing together some of those people who are a little interested in putting together farms that are more multidimensional. They end up providing food for the likes of the food co-op in a banner or to the farmers market. And they get together as a group and they're encouraged to be much more family-like. And I would like to encourage you to look at those sorts of tools and see how you can work with them. I recently was talking about this sort of thing in putting up fences. You just have a chisel, and you have to have a way of taking a tree and sawing it so that it is a slab. Or you put up a fence that is two posts and they're tied together with something. You might have a slip rail fence. You might just have a fence. We used to have one where you took down 3 rails and the cattle came in or went out. Some of the gates that were thought up were rather unique. You may have a box of stone on one end of a lever, and it goes up like the arms that you have on a railroad crossing. And they're just an imagination there. And if you know that history, it lets you think about the more modern aspects of what you do, which might be drones and artificial intelligence. The artificial intelligence will do certain jobs for you, and they'll do it repetitively. They'll do it quickly, and they can do it by the million that no human can do. So in some respects, AI takes over your job, but it's only the job that you tell it to do. So then apps become very important. But if you know your history, you can go back and you can be innovative. And when I look at this apple peeler, I'm looking at cogs and a way of sticking it onto a table so it will work. I'm seeing that if it's worn, it won't perhaps work as well. So you're thinking about the quality of the material in the cogs so they don't wear out. You might be wanting to have an amalgam of metals. You might have to oil it. But in 1850, this was an important machine because you had Johnny Appleseed, you had lots of apples, and if you're not careful, they will rot very quickly. So you can utilize them with a little bit of machinery. So there it is. If you're going to put up raw slabs on your on the outside of your building, they're going to be green probably. So they're going to shrink. So you take this drill and you put nails in, and you don't put them in very far. You leave it for a year, and then you take out that nail, or screw, and then condense the slabs, the cladding that's on the building, and put a new nail in, and then you can put it in properly and permanently. Just little things like that mean that as you go to places like the Idea Store or second-hand places, you can figure out what people were doing in the past and have a respect for them, and then think of how you can do it in the future. So if we go back to connectivity, and farming where it's more biodiverse, I want you to look at those plants that are out there that have been evolving for millions of years. And they've also been evolving since the last 10,000 years when glaciers retreated. You need to know that those areas dried up and that loess was spread across the country by wind. And it's very rich soil because the soils that were the rock and rubble that was ground by glaciers is very rich. But there are swamps and there are dry spots and there are spots in between. And we've been talking about the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, and the 14 ecosystems are part of Illinois. And so as you think of understanding your own territory, think of visiting some of these places. And some of them are quite remote, and you probably need a halfway decent vehicle to get there and to be sure that you're going to get back. And but they're interesting. And think about the railroads, which have been deregulated. At one stage there were so many railroads, that's the only way people came to town. That's the only way where they got grain to go out. Early on, even if you were a Mennonite, you would convert your corn to alcohol that could be transported. How did you transport that? Did you have wheels? Did you have skids? Did you transport your barrel of wine on a skid? How did you work with your horses? How did you shoe a horse? How did you interact with the horse? Did the horse live with you? Did your cow live with you? Did you? How do you have a carpet snake in your barn that controlled the mice and rats? And how did you interact with somebody who came and saw a snake and immediately killed it when it was your pet snake? How do we look at these sorts of things and look at them in fun? How do we perhaps do the same job? Could you make a fence post that had 2 or 3 square holes in it so that you could put a slab in sideways and have it maintain the dignity of a area so that cattle wouldn't be roaming around the town or hogs wouldn't be everywhere? Thinking of hogs, would you have artichokes that have roots that the hogs could enjoy? Do you get to look on your animals as pets? How do you then send them to an abattoir? How does that abattoir work? How does it work safely? What do you do with the offal? Where is our sanitary system going? All those things are interesting if you're curious. And then you can start to think about doing some interesting things yourself. And So it might start off with artwork. The Sloan artwork, you can see it on the front page, is telling you how a building was installed, how a road was installed. How did you put in a road on a landscape that is very wet? Well, you put down 2 logs longitudinally, and then you put corduroy logs on top. These were saplings that were all about the same size, and they were put across those 2 stringers, and you could take your oxen and your horses across the bog without problems. So some places where we have a historic farm or a historic railroad are very interesting to young people, especially because they are very aware that they're not going to have the same resources as their great-grandparents. And by the time they're through, we will have lost many more of the hummingbirds or the bumblebees or the creatures that we depended on for pollination. So there I am with my letter to the
Land Conservation Trust.
yes, it's not the land conservation. I'm thinking the detail is
You've got 1 minute.
connection. The land connection is to look at some of these plants and animals that are well adapted to the soil types that they're in. Can you take a compass plant, for instance, with the top 2 feet of its roots alone, let alone the above plant parts? They weigh probably 45, 50 pounds. Can that be lumber, or can it be fiber? So we need to put some of our resources into research of the land that we enjoy and have as little retreats here and there, and we should try and connect those retreats, because if a bird has to go 30 miles to find its mate in another retreat area that's not connected, that bird's not going to do very well, and that bumblebee is not going to do very well. And since the pollination is, we're dependent on those creatures like the bumblebee, then we need to have some biodiversity, and this is what the land connection is about. So you might want to attend that meeting in February the 14th at the I Hotel. You need to register beforehand. This is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And as always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.